There are faster ways to get from Da Nang to Hue. By car, it's about 2 hours, but today getting there fast isn't really the point. We're taking the train instead, a slower way that hugs the coastline, climbs over the Hai Van Pass, and turns the journey itself into the reason to go.
Attention please, for passengers with HD. Kính thưa quý khách, nhà ga
cái tour là nó hay là các bạn Trung Quốc với Thái
Đây kia là đá sửa từ bên ngoài tới bên trong đó. Nó không có địa điểm để tham quan nhiều đó, nên lên hầu như nó không có gì để tham quan nữa. Bây giờ nó đang trùng tu, nó đang sửa lại thì người ta hay nhìn chụp ảnh ở đây đó.
This time, I actually remembered to show you the room before we settled in. From the moment we walked in, it felt bright, calm, and spacious. Thanks to the corner layout, natural light filled the room from two directions throughout the day. The Indochine-inspired design immediately caught my eye. Warm wood, soft neutral colors, and rich teal accents created a space that felt both elegant and welcoming. After a long morning of traveling, it was exactly the kind of place we were hoping to come back to after exploring Hue. I'll be honest, I still struggle with the taste of mom tom. No matter how much kumquat and sugar I add, I just can't seem to get used to it. We ordered a mixed platter to try a bit of everything. Overall, it was a good experience, but probably not somewhere I'd come back to.
No turtle? Yes. We don't do any syrup for the. No syrup. Okay, then let me see. Then 2 pineapple juice. 2 pineapple juice. Thank you. Way down because the rice cake here are very sticky. Okay. You scoop all the way down. Okay. Perfect. Enjoy. Beef slices, some beef meatball, and crab cake. With some fresh vegetables and a chili to put into your broth. Please enjoy.
Earlier this morning, the Imperial City became the backdrop for our photo shoot, but we hardly had time to appreciate the place itself. So, we returned later, determined to experience it at a slower pace. And after yesterday's little detour, we knew exactly where to go. The Meridian Gate, the Imperial City's main entrance.
Kiến chung các còn kiến đại với kiến tiểu luôn.
Lên trên đây không chụp chéo, muốn ảnh chéo đây.
Đây đây để
Our final evening in Huế called for one last local specialty. Bánh ép had been recommended to us by several locals who insisted it tastes even better in the cooler evening hours.
Ngọc Phương với lại Lan Phương là một cặp vợ chồng.
Đi ra bán hàng đó, đừng cứ ra bán hàng.
Central Heritage Connection Journey train will serve as a meaningful bridge between here and Da Nang, bringing passengers. Totally rest while enjoying the breathtaking natural scene.